The Peterborough Chamber of Commerce proudly presents the 2021 Power Hour, a series of interviews with our elected officials, proudly sponsored by Cogeco and Your TV.
Greetings and welcome to the Think Tank. It's a series that we've put together talking to some of Peterborough's deeper thinkers. Don't insert any humor there. And I'm pleased to welcome MPP Dave Smith to this week's Think Tank. Welcome.
Thanks, Stu. I'm happy to be here.
So interesting times to be a community leader, isn't it? Obviously, we have to start with the pandemic, and I think that there's enough awareness out there that we don't really have to unpack all of the rules and regulations and that sort of thing. But I'm interested in sort of on a personal level what your reflections are over the last year, and what's it been like, sort of drinking from the fire hose.
It's been an interesting experience, I'll say that. I don't have a frame of reference as an elected official really prior to a pandemic. This is my first term as the MPP. So for me, this is almost the norm, having to go through all of this. But I will say it's a very difficult situation. And I think it's difficult for anybody who's in an elected official or elected position where we're making decisions that will have significant impacts on people's lives.
I've found personally that there's a lot of pressure to say the right thing. You know, I speak on behalf of the business community, and the business community has been, badly hurt by this roller coaster ride. But there's a lot of pressure to say the right thing, balancing between the interests of the consumer, the interests of the business community, the interests of public health, the interests of the government. So how have you found that when it comes to being asked a question, whether there's a microphone or not? This must be a tricky balance for you as well.
I think balance is probably the best way to describe it, because whenever someone approaches you with a question or a comment, they're looking at it from a single perspective. But everything that we're doing has a multi-pronged approach to it, and there's no simple answer to anything. So when someone comes up and prefaces a question with, don't you think it would be better if, well, okay, when you're making a decision, when you're coming out with policy, when you're making changes, you have to weigh all of those factors, and you do have to find the balance in it. So you're right. It's difficult at times because you don't want to offend someone. You want to acknowledge that what they're saying is something that is very true and very valid. But when you take it into the context of the bigger picture and you combine all of those things together, sometimes that simple answer that they're looking for is not a simple answer anymore. And it actually isn't the right answer. It might be the right answer for that particular situation with that particular question, but not when you factor in everything else.
I think there's also been an element of learning as we go, right? I mean, a year ago, we were still, sort of watching with certain level of curiosity. The premier famously quoted as, encouraging everybody to head off on March break. And I'm sure that's a piece of video that he was got erased. But, we just didn't know at the time. But I think over those first few months, there was some pretty harsh realities. And so, pivot is the word that everybody has learned to hate, but everybody had to pivot from the government on down, the premier especially. So any thoughts on that, what that was like?
I think you're absolutely correct on all of that. And when you take a look at the Premier Ford, he came from a business background, running a company for basically his entire life. He has been very much about the economy, very much about making sure that people had opportunities for good career-based jobs, not just a simple job. And for him, this was a massive shift in thought process, because you now have to weigh that economic need with the healthcare need. And how do you balance all of those things? You're absolutely correct. A couple of days before March break, he's saying the infection is not bad in Ontario. Don't be afraid. Go and enjoy your March break. And then 2 days later, he's, okay, we've made a mistake. But no, It's very, very serious, and we're seeing spread in Ontario now, and we have to make a change.
We had an event on the 13th of March where we had 80 people gathered in a hall and did our annual business summit, and everybody eating from the buffet, and the whole 9 yards. And on the 14th, I've always said if we'd had it on the 14th, we would have canceled it, because I think on the 13th, I think Sophie Gregoire Trudeau announced that she had Tom Hanks. There was some government announcements, and all of a sudden it was like, and we were aware on the 13th, but literally the next day, everything changed. And kudos to the Premier, who I think has been universally recognized as stepping up in many of the right ways, and sort of bringing a human element to those press conferences and those updates. I'm sure that you've seen that as well.
Very much so, and you can see that it is weighing on him. I think the world of Doug, and I have said to him a few times, you have to go to bed before midnight. You can't stay up until midnight working and then get up again at 5 o'clock and start doing more stuff. And he talks about the need for helping people in Ontario. He constantly talks about that. This has weighed very heavily on him personally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the Doug Ford that we have seen in caucus the entire time that he's been there is the Doug Ford that people are seeing now. That genuinely caring man who is willing to do whatever he needs to do to help. There have been a few things that he personally has done that has done very good things for individuals, and
mm-hmm.
we've been asked not to talk about it because it's the type of thing that when it comes out, there would be other people who'd be knocking on his door personally, asking him to do the same thing for them. I liken it to the person who wins Lotto 649. As soon as their name is published, they have an awful lot of friends who
That's right. But he's also famous for handing out his cell phone number and taking those calls, making those calls, that sort of thing. But yeah, I think that there's a side of him, and part of it may be because his mother-in-law was in long-term care, so there was a real personal connection there. But he also made that personal connection with the rest of us as well, and kind of balanced. Frankly, the fear that we all felt with the practicality. My wife works in a long-term care home here in Peterborough, so I've got sort of a personal knowledge of that stress and that fear and what that takes to put your mask on and go into a situation like that, and the responsibility of going in there safely and coming out of there safely as well. And so I think there was a personal connection. And I think, let's be honest, I think that there was also some lessons learned around public health and the respect for public health, and the knowledge and the fact that all of us have been standing behind public health and the expertise. And so I think there's some lessons learned there as well.
Yeah, I would say that's a very accurate statement. And I think that there's a lot of other challenges that we have seen as a result of the structure of public health. When we're talking about a pandemic, we have, as we have been talking about the pandemic, we have 34 different health units in Ontario. We do have regional differences, but it's sometimes very difficult to have 34 public medical officers of health come together on the same page on something. And to Premier Ford's credit, he's been able to bring all of those voices together and come out with a unified message that is actually in the best interest of everybody in Ontario. I'm not sure that a lot of other people would have done quite as well as what he has done. Let's be honest on it. A lot of times at the very beginning of our mandate, he was at odds with the medical officers of health for various reasons. But they've all been able to come together and work towards the common goal of making sure that the people in Ontario are as safe and healthy as possible as we move forward. And I think that bodes very, very well for everybody involved with that, because it demonstrates that although you may have different philosophical approaches, if you focus on what's right for the people, you will always get it right.
Yeah.
And if you drop those partisan lines, so to speak, or those philosophical differences, and simply focus on what is the end game that we're all trying to get to, and how do we get there.
Is it too soon to be talking about lessons learned? From my own perspective, again, because my wife, she was actually in intensive care at the time during the SARS outbreak. And after SARS, there was, I'm not sure if it was a Royal Commission, I think it was the Roberts Report. And you have to wonder how many people actually read that, because it didn't really seem like the lessons were learned. There's a lot of recommendations in there that we could have used a year ago. So I'm assuming people are talking about that already, is, the lessons learned in the last year, and when it comes to public health and the approach to how to deal with an outbreak or the third wave or the next pandemic. I'm assuming people are already talking about the best approach to take, as opposed to everything that we've tried in the last year. There's been a lot of changes.
We get a weekly update on how things are going with COVID. And with respect to the lessons learned, absolutely, that is what is going on. North America has an advantage. We are all going through the pandemic, don't get me wrong. We are all going through the pandemic, but we have an advantage of seeing what's happened in other jurisdictions. We knew what happened in Europe in the first wave, just prior to the first wave hitting Ontario. We saw what worked and what didn't work over there. And we were able to make adjustments to our own plan based on that. And then when the second wave hit in Europe, it hit prior to the second wave coming to North America. And we were able to see what they did that was good and what they did that wasn't as effective, and make adjustments then to our own plan. We're just coming out of the second wave right now. But if you take a look at the UK, they're in the third wave. So what did they do appropriately in the second wave to reduce the infections? And more importantly, what didn't they do after the second wave that caused the growth of the third wave? And how can we make adjustments then so that we mitigate the chance of having a third wave?
Yeah. I stopped saying we're all in this together quite some time ago, because I recognize, and I know you do as well, we're still getting paid. But there's certainly lots of people, particularly in the business community, and because of my position, I hear a lot of those stories and a lot of that pain. And we have at times watched quite helplessly as, particularly when the second wave came along and the restrictions came into place, the stay-at-home order on the 26th is really, really painful, and people just business owners getting further and further into debt, as they wait in quiet desperation for this to turn around. But through that, I sense that there's been a change in thinking when it comes to lockdowns. And I know this is somewhat controversial, but from our perspective, we're looking at the way the business community operates in a number of other ways. So WSIB, for example, there's a lot of rules and regulations that regulate how you can operate and how you can't operate as a business in the province. Public health, restaurants are heavily governed, as they should be, by public health, and they know exactly what to do to follow the rules and the regulations. And from my perspective, the vast majority of businesses in the province know what to do when it comes to mitigating a pandemic, COVID-19, when it comes to limiting the number of people in their facilities, masking, insisting on mask policies, social distancing, everything that they're supposed to do, they're doing in the vast majority of cases. And so where we're getting to as a Chamber of Commerce, a lobby group for businesses, let's really question the next time we're looking at a complete lockdown, because I think it's proving to be a fairly clumsy tool. You can argue that it has worked over the last few weeks. I totally understand that. But we're wondering if there's another way to do this with the less severe, punitive lockdowns of business right across the province. And I'm just wondering what your perspective is on that.
It's a valid point. And if you don't look at all of the options, then you're not going to be able to come up with the best option to take. And I will also agree with you that the lockdown itself is a clumsy tool. It's taking a sledgehammer to something that may not necessarily need a sledgehammer. If you look at what happened, though, from the first wave leading into the second wave, we went through that initial lockdown. We saw the numbers drop dramatically. We got to a point where we had less than 100 infections per day in Ontario, and we were moving along, opening things back up again. We were asking different businesses to implement different strategies as they were going. And then we saw the infection rate start to climb, and we made adjustments to what businesses were doing and asked them to make adjustments in their health and safety plans. And then December hit, and we saw a significant spike in infections. And then we saw a significant spike in hospitalization. And then that was followed by a significant spike in ICU beds. So to your point that yes, wherever possible, you want to deal with this without having to do a lockdown. But we got to a point in Ontario where we had hit that critical measure, and we needed to have a significant restart, if you can call it that way. And unfortunately, the only way to do that was to seriously limit travel and interaction between people. And that effectively is what the lockdown does, is it stops people from moving around. The virus moves with people. It doesn't move on its own. If you can reduce the number of touch points where you have an opportunity to come in contact with the virus, that's a very good way of doing things. And that's what we were trying back in the fall. But we got to the point where we had to stop as much as possible people movement so that it was not going to be moved from location to location. And unfortunately, the only tool that we have in the toolbox to do that is a lockdown. Well, I shouldn't say that. There is a second tool, but it's a tool that you do not want to use. And that is limit movement completely by curfewing and preventing people from traveling from one location to another location. Can you imagine what would happen in a country like Canada, any democratic country, where checkpoints have to be set up and you have to prove why you need to go from one city to another? In Peterborough, for example, we have a large population that works in Oshawa. Can you imagine setting up a checkpoint on the 115? Why are you leaving Peterborough to come down to Durham? Why are you leaving Durham to come up to Peterborough? That just is not acceptable. That is a tool that's in the toolbox, but it's a tool that can never be taken out of that toolbox.
Yeah, I agree there. I will suggest, though, that the third tool might be enforcement. And I'm thinking of the fuss that happened just before Christmas when the 26th stay-at-home order was announced. And it came along with some suggestion of fines. There was all sorts of rumors about the police pulling people over to find out where they were going, none of which was really true. But think about the effect that had, the concept of enforcement. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about following the rules and regulations. If as a business, you're not following the rules and regulations, there are penalties, there are fines, you can be shut down. And I think the public also got that same message. If I'm gathering in a parking lot somewhere with a bunch of people, I'm going to get questioned because I'm not following the proper rules and regulations. So I think that there's an opportunity for enforcement there within reason that would also help control the situation. So, any reaction to that?
Sure. One of the challenges that you have with enforcement is the human resources of actually enforcing it. And
yeah.
Although we have an exceptional police force in the city of Peterborough, and the OPP does an exceptional job in the county, they don't have the human resources to do that level of enforcement. The health unit doesn't have the human resources to do that level of enforcement, which means that you need to reach out to something like the Canadian Armed Forces to do it. And I'm old enough that I know the history, but did not experience it actually happening, and that is the War Measures Act. I'm not sure that Canada would ever be ready for a federal government to implement something like that Canada-wide. And that is really what it would take. In order to have the military do that, they would have to receive special powers, special policing powers in order to do it. And I don't think you ever want to be in a position where your military becomes your police.
Right. I agree with that, but I'll just swing the pendulum back a little bit to picture the restaurant that knows that if they are not following the health regulations and if they get inspected, they're going to be shut down. So it's just the prospect of being inspected I mean, people are law-abiding citizens. Businesses are law-abiding business owners, right? I mean, it's not like you need the military to come in and check and make sure people are social distancing in the Tim Hortons parking lot, right? So let's just leave it there. To me,
with respect to the military aspect, I'm not suggesting that we would have armed soldiers with their M16s wandering through the streets.
Totally agree.
They may very well be wearing civilian outfits. You would have to have that pool of bodies to do it.
Yeah,
and
fair enough.
With respect to your comment about people being law-abiding, absolutely, I agree. The vast majority of people would want to do the right thing, but we've also seen examples of those who did not. And the perfect example is Adam's Barbecue in the Toronto area, who blatantly broke the rules and then started a GoFundMe campaign to pay for his legal expenses and fines, and received significantly more money on his GoFundMe than what his actual expenses were. So you do have a very large element of people in our communities who disagree with everything that is happening, and they are more than willing to put their money where their mouth is to make sure that their opinion is the prevalent opinion.
Yeah.
And we have to be very, very cautious that whatever we're doing finds that balance. We go back to the first thing that we talked about, which was balance. How do you balance this? How do you make sure that no one their voice is not being heard? And how do you make sure that you're doing what is right for as many people as possible?
It's a pickle. Let's cast our eyes forward to this fall. Hope against hope that the variants don't get us first, that we're all vaccinated, or those who want to be are all vaccinated, and we're now in recovery mode. I think it's obviously going to take a while, but where are you on the fundamentals of recovery when it comes to balancing responsibilities between municipal governments, provincial government, the federal government? There's a lot of money that's been spent, and I think that there's a lot of money that needs to be channeled into some fundamentals of economic recovery. So what are your thoughts on that?
We're going through the budget process right now, so it's very timely that you talk about that. I'm of the belief that you should never measure your success by how much money you spend. You should measure your success by the net outcome of that, because really what people want is the result from it. If it takes $100 million to do something and it's done very, very well, that was $100 million well spent. If it takes $350 million to do the same thing and you can't account for 200 of that, well, that probably wasn't money that was well spent. So when we're doing stuff, as we're working through it, all levels of government have to make sure that they're surgically placing the funds in the most appropriate place. And all levels of government have to recognize that ultimately it's being paid for by the same person, whether it's coming from the federal coffer, the provincial coffer, or the municipal coffer. It is Joe average person on the street whose tax dollars are paying for that. And if you take money from the federal side to do something, that's fine. If you use provincial money to do it, again, that's fine. But if it doesn't make sense to tax the greater population to pay for it, because it's a very specific thing to a small area, then it does make more sense to be a little bit more surgical in how you adjust those funds. Ultimately, though, all levels of government have to be focused on keeping everyone safe and finding the most appropriate economic recovery. If we don't have businesses thriving, the province doesn't have, the federal government as well, doesn't have revenue coming in. If we don't have people who are gainfully employed, municipal governments can't receive property taxes because homes are empty, businesses are empty. Full businesses that are functioning, full homes that have families living in them provide taxes to pay for all of these things. We can't be in the spot where, to use a Bruce Springsteen song, My Hometown, you can't have whitewashed windows and vacant stores. That can't happen. So you have to do things that keep businesses open so that people are employed and people can do things to recover. Focusing on the local buying process is one of the best ways of doing it as well.
Yeah. My apologies to interrupt you. There's a lot of balls in the air that when it comes to that conversation, municipally, provincially, and federally, and one of the other key barriers to business growth is regulation, and not regulation. I'm not talking about regulation that just sort of throws caution to the wind. More just along the lines of the sheer opportunity cost of multi-layered regulations, even as simple as cross-border trade between provinces. It's easier to do business with another country than it is to do business with Alberta or Quebec. And so there's a lot to unpack there. And the analogy that comes up is have everyone singing from the same songbook. Well, who's writing the songbook right now when it comes to how are we all going to cooperate municipally, provincially, federally in order to make sure that we lay some pavement for an effective recovery? And it's not just about throwing money at it, right? There's got to be a strategy.
Very much so. It's something that we have talked about since we were first elected, that we have free trade within North America, but we don't have free trade within Canada. Mm-hmm. We have talked about reducing a number of the barriers that we have. I'll give a very simple one. It's probably a bad one that I'm going to be attacked on, but let's take the beer industry just as a perfect example of it. The way that the legislation had been written previously in multiple provinces, the brewery must exist in the province, otherwise it's considered import beer, and there's additional tariffs that are put on it. That's a great example of where we have created inefficiencies in it. The thought at the time was that you're keeping jobs. You're making sure that employer exists in that province or that area in order to have people working. And the downside to it is that you put up financial barriers that prevent then people from buying that product. Imagine if we were to say all vehicles that you buy must be built in the province that you live in. Manitoba would have a really hard time buying vehicles.
Yeah.
Same thing with farm equipment. Same thing with housing. All of those things kind of come into play. So what can provinces do to open that up, to make it easier? And again, it becomes a balance, because whenever you make a change, it's disruptive and it will affect jobs. Can you do something then that creates more economic opportunity and more jobs by making a shift? And that's the approach that has to be taken. Is how do you guarantee that you're not going to damage the economy when you do that? How do you make it so that another industry can thrive to make up for whatever losses are? And then do you have the ability to accept that you may put a business out of business by that decision?
Yeah, well, there's certainly been a lot of that. And perhaps to wrap up, we can just touch on the concept of local, keeping your dollars in town, because globalization has a lot to answer for, and I think that there has been a lot revealed in the last year about the weaknesses of that. Trade with the U.S., Brexit. China. There's a lot to unpack there, but through it all, and obviously it's a thing for the chamber to just relentlessly encourage the support of our local businesses. And so I'm wondering where you land on that, the balance between giving our local businesses the opportunity to trade wherever they want, but also sort of enforcing that mentality that we have to support our own.
One of the things you have to look at it, I believe, at least, is the total cost of ownership or the total cost of investment when you're looking at anything. It may be cheaper initially to buy something through Amazon.com or Amazon.ca. If you can buy that same item though locally from your local person, there's actually a bigger value in doing it, because Amazon doesn't sponsor any of your kids' teams. Amazon doesn't do things like put money towards Music Fest in the summer, but every local business does. So that dollar that you're spending downtown, that dollar that you're spending with someone local, is helping your next door neighbor as well as yourself, your family, and everybody around you. But if you send that dollar to, again, using Amazon as the example, because they're a large internet provider or internet retailer, there is no local advantage. Texas A&M did a study a number of years ago about discretionary spending and how a single dollar of discretionary spending returns $4.30 in actual economic return. It's the same concept locally. If you're buying things from the local store downtown, that money is recycling back into the community. So your dollar spent downtown has a much higher value than your dollar spent to an online retailer.
Right. Well, on that note, we're at time, so I want to thank you personally for taking the time and having sort of a more personal conversation about the last year. I really appreciate your perspective, and I respect what you've been through as one of our elected leaders. So, thanks again, Dave. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Joe. I really appreciate this as well.
MPP Dave Smith, and that is the Think Tank.
Our Think Tank episode is brought to you by Merit Precision Molding, Microwave Peterborough Whitby, Canopy Support Services, and TD. The 2021 Power Hour, podcast, videocast, signature event. Details at peterboroughchamber.ca.